They called him the Battleship. On the ice, Albert Leduc was an unstoppable force, a combination of brute strength and the heart of an artist. He conquered the city and became its king. But even battleships can be sunk, not by a stronger opponent, but by betrayal and cold-blooded calculations behind the scenes. With his kingdom taken away, Albert Leduc's true battle began. This is not just the story of a champion, it is the story of an unsinkable spirit and of a man who refused to let history forget him. To understand a man like Albert Leduc, you have to understand the world that made him. Imagine Montreal in the 1920s. The city is electric, a vibrant, chaotic mix of English and French, of smoky jazz clubs and solemn stone cathedrals. It's the roaring 20s, but for the working-class French Canadians in the city's East End, life isn't about champagne and flapper dresses. It's about hard work, faith and family, and it's about hockey. In this era, hockey wasn't just a sport, it was a religion. It was a place where the frustrations and hopes of a community could be unleashed. And the Montreal Forum wasn't just an arena, it was the high church of this new religion. On a Saturday night, the air inside crackled with the energy of thousands of fans, packed shoulder to shoulder, their breath misting in the cold. The smell of roasted peanuts and stale cigar smoke filled the air. This was before multi-million-dollar contracts, before helmets, and long before the game was sanitized for television. This was hockey in its rawest form, part ballet, part brawl. The players were not distant celebrities. They were sons of the city. They worked summer jobs as bricklayers, plumbers, or factory hands. They were one of the people, and their battles on the ice felt like extensions of the everyday struggles of the fans who adored them. To be a player for Les Canadiens was the ultimate dream for any French-Canadian boy. It meant you had made it. You weren't just a hockey player, you were a hero, a symbol of pride for a people often made to feel like second-class citizens in their own country. This was the world waiting for Albert Leduc, a world of immense pressure, fervent adoration, and a chance at immortality. He was born Joseph Albert Leduc on November 22, 1902, in Salaberry de Valleyfield, a small, industrial town nestled along the St. Lawrence River in Quebec. It was a place where life was dictated by the seasons and the rhythms of the local mills. For young Albert, his escape and his passion were found on the frozen surfaces of that very river. Long before organised leagues and professional coaching, this was where hockey was learned. It was played on windswept ice with whatever you could find for pucks and pads. It was a game of instinct, of toughness, born from falling on hard, unforgiving ice and getting right back up again. From a young age, it was clear Leduc was different. He was bigger, stronger, and more determined than the other boys. He possessed a raw, physical power that was impossible to ignore. He wasn't the most elegant skater, but he moved with a relentless, driving force, like a freighter cutting through icy water. And he had a shot, a heavy, blistering blast that goalies of the era, with their primitive pads, grew to fear. He was a defenseman by trade, but he played with the heart of a rover, unafraid to rush the puck from one end of the ice to the other, in a thundering display of power. His reputation grew throughout the semi-professional leagues of Quebec. He was a force of nature, a player who could change the course of a game with a single bone-rattling body check or a goal from an impossible angle. Scouts took notice, and in 1925, the call came. It was the call every boy from Valleyfield to Montreal dreamed of. The Montreal Canadiens wanted him. At 23 years old, Albert Leduc was about to step onto the biggest stage in hockey. He was coming home to a city that was ready to crown a new king. When Albert Leduc first pulled on the iconic bleu, blanc et rouge sweater of the Canadiens, he joined a team that was already the stuff of legend. This was the era of the Flying Frenchmen, a team renowned for its breathtaking speed and offensive firepower. He shared the ice with gods of the game. There was Howie Morenz, the Stratford Streak, arguably the first true superstar of hockey, a skater whose speed was so dazzling it seemed to defy physics. There was Aurel Joliard, the fiery, pint-sized forward who played with a black cap pulled down over his ears and a ferocity that belied his size. Into this world of speed and finesse came Leduc. He wasn't a flying Frenchman in the traditional sense. He was something else entirely. Soon after his arrival, the legendary sports writer Elmer Ferguson, searching for the right word to describe this unstoppable force on the blue line, found it. He called him Battleship. The name was perfect. It captured everything about him: his size, his power, his utter fearlessness. He was the protector of his more graceful teammates. When opposing forwards came roaring into the Canadiens' zone, they didn't just have to beat a defenseman. They had to get through a battleship. His style was a study in controlled aggression. In an age of vicious stick-swinging and bench-clearing brawls, Leduc was a devastatingly effective physical player. His body checks were legendary, not just for their power, but for their timing. He would line up an opponent, and the resulting collision would echo through the forum, a sound that brought the crowd to its feet in a single, unified roar. He played with a palpable joy in the physical contest, often sporting a wide, almost gleeful grin after sending an opponent sprawling. But to label him a mere goon or a defensive defenseman would be a massive injustice. Leduc was a surprisingly gifted offensive player. He had a knack for knowing exactly when to join the rush, his powerful strides eating up the ice as he carried the puck deep into enemy territory. His shot was his ultimate weapon. It was said that he didn't just shoot the puck, he launched it. Goalies who stopped a Leduc slapshot often complained of stinging palms for minutes afterward. This combination of defensive grit and offensive flair made him one of the most complete and valuable defensemen of his generation. Almost immediately, he became a fan favourite. The working-class fans at the Forum saw themselves in him. He wasn't a product of a privileged upbringing. He was one of them, a man who played hockey with the same hard-working, no-nonsense attitude they brought to their own jobs every day. But there was another layer to his popularity, something that went beyond his on-ice performance. Albert Leduc was a natural-born showman. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that professional hockey was a performance. The fans paid their hard-earned money not just to see a game, but to be entertained, to escape their troubles for a few hours. And Leduc gave them a show every single night. He had a running dialogue with the crowd, especially the hecklers who sat near the glass. He would jaw back and forth with them, a playful smirk on his face. He argued with referees, not with malice, but with a theatrical flair, throwing his hands in the air and pleading his case with the dramatic agony of a stage actor. He played to the cheap seats, ensuring everyone in the building felt like they were part of the action. This larger-than-life persona made him a legend in Montreal. He was more than just a player. He was a personality. Kids across Quebec would imitate his signature puck rushes in their street hockey games. Stories of his exploits, both on and off the ice, were traded in taverns and barbershops across the city. He was the heart and soul of the team's defense, the unsinkable battleship that protected the Flying Frenchmen as they soared to incredible heights. The culmination of this golden era came at the turn of the decade, with Leduc anchoring the defense and superstars like Morenz and Joliat leading the attack. The Canadiens became an unstoppable force. In the 1929-1930 season, they embarked on a historic playoff run. They battled their way to the Stanley Cup Finals against the mighty Boston Bruins, a team that had dominated the league that year, losing only 5 games all season. The Bruins were the clear favourites, a powerhouse expected to steamroll the Canadiens. But they didn't have Battleship Leduc. In a hard-fought, brutal series, Montreal shocked the hockey world. They swept the Bruins in 2 games. Leduc was a titan in that series, shutting down Boston's top scorers and contributing on offense. The final whistle blew in the Forum, and the city of Montreal exploded in delirious celebration. Albert Leduc, the boy from Valleyfield, was a Stanley Cup champion. The celebration was a testament to his status. The parade through the city streets was a sea of adoring faces, chanting his name. He was on top of the world. And to prove it wasn't a fluke, they did it all again the very next year. In 1931, the Canadiens once again hoisted the Stanley Cup, cementing their status as a dynasty. Leduc was now a 2-time champion. He had reached the pinnacle of his sport. He was a hero in his hometown, a beloved figure who seemed inseparable from the team and the city he represented. It felt like a storybook ending, a perfect union that would last forever. But in the business of professional sports, loyalty is temporary, and just as he reached the summit, his world was about to be turned upside down. The early 1930s brought a chill that had nothing to do with the ice at the Forum. The Great Depression had tightened its grip on North America, and its effects were felt everywhere, including the National Hockey League. Team owners were bleeding money, attendance was down, and an era of financial austerity began. Players' salaries were slashed, and general managers were forced to make impossible choices, trading away popular players simply to keep their teams afloat. For the Canadiens, the financial strain was immense. At the same time, Leduc, now in his early 30s, was no longer the young, unstoppable force he had once been. The hundreds of games, the thousands of body checks, and the brutal punishing style of the era had begun to take their toll. He was still a star, still a formidable presence, but the league was getting younger and faster. Management, looking to cut costs and rebuild for the future, began to look at their veteran players not as icons, but as assets on a balance sheet. Leduc, for his part, seemed oblivious to the changing tides. He was a Canadian, through and through. The thought of playing for another team was unimaginable. Montreal was his home. The Forum was his stage. He had given his body and soul to the team, and he believed, with the fierce loyalty of a hometown hero, that his loyalty would be returned. He couldn't have been more wrong. The day it happened began like any other. It was near the start of the 1933-34 season. The news came down not with a respectful, face-to-face meeting, but with the cold indifference of a business transaction. Albert Battleship Leduc, the heart of the Canadiens' defence, the 2-time Stanley Cup champion, the beloved showman, had been traded. To understand why that destination, the New York Rangers, was a dagger to the heart of every Montreal fan, you have to understand the deep rivalry between them. The Rangers were everything the Canadiens were not. They were an American team from the flashy, chaotic world of New York City. For the fiercely proud French-Canadian fans of Montreal, a trade to any team would have been a blow. For the fans, trading him to the Rangers felt like the ultimate betrayal. The news hit Leduc like one of his own body checks. He was stunned, then heartbroken, then furious. This was more than a trade. It was an exile. He was being cast out of the only hockey home he had ever known. The reasons given were cold and corporate. His salary was too high. The team needed to get younger. But for Leduc, it was a deeply personal wound. He had built his identity around being a Montreal Canadien. The bleu, blanc et rouge was a part of his skin. Now, he was being told he was no longer wanted, no longer good enough. His teammates were equally shocked. The dressing room, once a place of loud jokes and easy camaraderie, fell silent. How could the team trade its battleship? He was a fixture, a part of the very foundation of their success. For the fans, the reaction was one of pure outrage. They felt like their team's soul had been sold for cash. How could the owners discard a hero, a man who had brought them 2 championships, with such callous disregard? For Leduc, the hardest part was the departure. Leaving his home, His family and the city that had worshipped him was an agony. He had to pack up his life and head to a strange, new city to wear a strange new uniform and to play for a team he had once considered a bitter enemy. The man who had been a king in Montreal was now just another player, a hired gun in the Big Apple. The lights of the Montreal Forum, which had illuminated his greatest triumphs, were now behind him. Ahead lay the uncertain glow of Broadway and a future he had never wanted. As he left the city, a profound question must have echoed in his mind. For a man who was so much a part of his home, could any other place ever truly feel like home again? The city's battleship had been sent into exile, and no one knew if he would ever truly find his way home again. Arriving in New York City in 1933 was like stepping onto another planet. For a man like Leduc, whose life had been rooted in the familiar rhythms of French-Canadian culture, the sheer scale and relentless pace of Manhattan must have been a shock. The cavernous expanse of Madison Square Garden was a world away from the intimate, almost familial intensity of the Forum. In Montreal, the fans were his neighbors, his people. In New York, they were spectators, a tougher, more cynical crowd that demanded results and had little time for sentiment. He was no longer our battleship. He was the new guy, the expensive veteran brought in to shore up the Rangers' blue line. Professionally, Leduc did what he always did. He played hard. He put on the blue shirt of the Rangers and threw the same crushing body checks, blocked the same blistering shots, and tried to contribute with his signature offensive rushes. But those who watched him closely noticed a change. The joyful, theatrical flair seemed muted. The playful grin was seen less often. He was still a formidable player, but the fire that had been fueled by the adoration of his hometown crowd now seemed to burn a little lower. He was a professional doing his job, but the passion that had made him a legend felt displaced. He played a full season with the Rangers, a respectable, solid performance. But the fit was never quite right. He was a French-Canadian icon playing in an American metropolis, a man whose identity was tied to one team now wearing the jersey of a rival. It was a period of professional limbo. The following season, he was on the move again, this time traded to the Ottawa Senators. If New York was a foreign land, Ottawa was a return to a more familiar Canadian hockey environment. But the Senators were a struggling team, a shadow of their former glory. For Leduc, it was another step down, another move further away from the championship heights he had known. He was no longer a cornerstone of a dynasty. He was a veteran journeyman, passed from one team to another as his career began its inevitable decline. Then, in 1935, a strange and bittersweet opportunity arose. The Montreal Canadiens, the very team that had cast him out, wanted him back. It wasn't the triumphant return he might have dreamed of. He was acquired as a depth player, a seasoned hand to help guide a younger team. For a brief, fleeting moment, he was home. He pulled on the Canadiens' sweater once more and skated onto the ice at the Forum. The roar from the crowd was a warm, welcoming echo of the past. For a few games, it was like old times. There was Battleship Leduc, back on the Montreal blue line where he belonged. But it was a cruel illusion. He played only 4 games in his second stint with the team. He was older, slower, and the game had moved on. The magic couldn't be recaptured. At the end of those 4 games, the Canadiens released him. This time, the departure was quieter, more final. The first trade had been a shock. This felt like a confirmation. His time at the top was over. His NHL career, for all intents and purposes, had come to an end. It was a quiet, unceremonious exit for a player whose presence had once been so thunderous. But Albert Leduc was not a man to simply fade away. His love for the game ran too deep. When the NHL doors closed, he didn't retire. Instead, He did what countless aging players did in that era. He went down to the minor leagues. For the next 5 years, he became a wanderer of the American Hockey League, playing for teams like the Providence Reds and the New Haven Eagles. Imagine the scene: the 2-time Stanley Cup champion, the former NHL All-Star, riding long, overnight buses to play in small, drafty arenas in front of a few hundred people. The glamour was gone. The adoring crowds were a distant memory. All that was left was the game itself. This period, often overlooked in his biography, may be the most revealing of his character. He kept playing not for the money, which was a pittance compared to his NHL salary, and certainly not for the fame. He played because he was a hockey player. It was who he was. On those cold nights in forgotten arenas, he taught younger players the lessons he had learned, showed them the grit and determination it took to survive in the professional game. The showman was gone, replaced by a grizzled veteran who simply refused to hang up his skates. He was no longer a star in the main fleet, but the battleship was still sailing, powered by a pure love for the game. Finally, in 1940, at the age of 38, he played his last professional game. The roar of the crowd was replaced by a quiet finality. Albert Leduc went home to Montreal, not as a returning hero, but as a private citizen, facing the daunting question that confronts every professional athlete. What now? Life after the cheering stops is often the hardest battle an athlete ever faces. For years, your identity is forged in the crucible of public performance. You are what you do. When that is taken away, the silence can be deafening. Albert Leduc returned to a city that still remembered him, but had also moved on. The Canadiens had new heroes. The game had new stars. He was a legend, but a legend from a bygone era. He had to build a new life from scratch. His first venture was a classic choice for a retired athlete. He opened a tavern in Montreal. It became a local landmark, a place where you could get a cold beer and, if you were lucky, hear a story from the man himself about the old days. You can picture him there, a big man behind the bar, his hands, which once held a hockey stick with such power, now expertly pulling a draft. Old teammates and sports writers would stop by, and for a few hours, the tavern would be filled with talk of the Flying Frenchman, of epic battles with the Bruins, of the roar of the Forum on a championship night. In these moments, he wasn't just a tavern owner. He was Battleship Leduc again, holding court. But this life also held a quiet sadness. It can be a heavy burden to be constantly surrounded by memories of who you used to be. He was a living monument, a man beloved for who he used to be. While he was proud of his past, he was a man who lived in the present. The tavern provided a living, but eventually he sought a different kind of stability. He sold the bar and took a job that couldn't have been further from the spotlight. He went to work for the city of Montreal. It was a steady, anonymous job, the kind his fans had worked their entire lives. The man who had once been the toast of the town, whose name had been chanted by thousands, now quietly went about his work, a humble civil servant. Albert Leduc's legacy isn't etched in record books, but in the heart of the city he embodied. He was a folk hero, a showman, whose artistry on the ice gave a generation a reason to cheer. His story is also a bitter lesson in the cold business of sports, a reminder that even the most beloved heroes can be treated as commodities. Yet, after the cheering stopped, Leduc defined his own victory. He didn't chase the spotlight. He found dignity in an ordinary life, anchoring himself in the city he loved. The Battleship nickname was never just about strength, but about an unsinkable spirit. And his greatest triumph was not a cup won on the ice, but a full and memorable life, quietly and proudly lived.